Hey, what's up guys? This is Kerr, and I'm doing this quick tutorial on how to do retopology. I'm going to show you two different methods. I'm going to show you how to do the Z remesher here inside of ZBrush, and I'm also going to show you how to retopologize inside of Maya using the quad draw tool. Now this came from a request from a user, and I think is very important because topology is one of the biggest hurdles a beginning modeler has to conquer, and it's one of the most necessary ones as well, because without good topology your model's pretty much useless outside of possibly just looking pretty. Now there could be several reasons why you have like kind of sloppy topology. You could have used the Dynamesh feature inside of ZBrush if you were sculpting it, which is what I initially did to create this T-Rex model here. I've isolated the head from the rest of the body just so I can focus just on this portion. I just deleted the rest of the body from this version of the model. But going back to what I was talking about, like I said, you could have used a Dynamesh start and decided that you need a better topology base because of several reasons. One, like I said, bad topology is just not going to work for animation, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, or even general posing of the model. But there might be some instances where retopology might not be necessary if you're using it for like a 3D print and you just need a decimated topology to send to a 3D printer. But for all intents and purposes, a good topology structure is 100% necessary. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So let's see here. If we take all our geometry, I'm going to pull down the subtool palette and go to all low because I have everything at its highest subdivision level right now. I'll go ahead and pause the video while this thinks about it. Okay, so we've now sent this model down to its low subdivision level. Now I should note that this model's already been retopologized, and if we take a look at its polygon structure here, and we'll just go ahead and solo this from the rest of the mesh, we can see here we have nice even quads throughout the model, and we have nice animator-friendly topology around areas of high deformation. So the way I set this up to be animated, and some of you may have seen my T-Rex test animation on the channel, but I needed good topology, especially around the eye, because it was going to blink. So you need quite a bit of topology here so we can see that we have quite a few quads going around the eye, and it really allowed for a good blink deformation. And I also have topology in a specific structure around the nostril because it's going to expand and contract while it's breathing. And the rest of the model, I just made sure that the edge flow was good. So I wanted to make sure that the topology was flowing along the model in a way that made sense, just to really get an idea of the underlying anatomy of the animal. Okay, but like I said, in areas where good deformation is needed, it's especially important that your geometry flows in the direction of the underlying muscle structure. That way the geometry can deform nice and evenly. Okay, so let's just pretend for the sake of argument that this model is just high resolution. Okay, we'll go back and send this to the highest resolution, and you only have this one subdivision level. Actually, I'll go ahead and delete all the lower subdivision levels to pretend that this is what we've got. Maybe this is your Dynamesh base. So if I were to actually Dynamesh this, I'm not going to actually do that because I don't really need to, but let's just say for the sake of argument you have done that. So under the Geometry subtool palette, you'll see the Dynamesh feature here, and if you're already using it, you already know what this is about. But Dynamesh gives you a good sculpting formation, but it doesn't give you a good animation formation. So retopology is a necessary step. Now let me tell you a little bit about when I like to typically retopologize. When the model's at this level of detail that you see here, it's typically kind of late in the process. I prefer to retopologize somewhere around the halfway point of the completion of the model. That way I have the general silhouette in place, but I don't necessarily have all the details in place. Now the reason I like to do it at like the halfway point, if I'm gonna construct it in a sculpting workflow from the beginning, is because you're at a level of detail where, like I said, the general silhouette's in place, and it's going to be easier on the detail projection to get it all the way through. To get the detail all the way through, I should say, without too much of a problem. When you have your mesh at its full level of detail, you could potentially run into problems, especially in areas where you have like a lot of cavities in the model, like around here, the scales along the nasal cavity or along the snout. Sometimes that detail can be hard to project through, especially if you're not working with a computer that's gonna have like infinite amount of resources like you would find at a visual effects house. Now I'm working on a standard off-the-shelf Mac, so that's, like I said, when I would typically like to retopologize is the halfway point. So pretend in this case that all of the silhouette is in place, but this is all smooth, like there's no scale detail whatsoever. I usually add that after the retopology stage. So finally, I'm going to get into actually retopology, but I felt a good bit of background was going to be kind of welcome, especially to the beginning user. So let's go ahead and go down to the ZRemesher pull down. Okay, now this is a nice tool that was introduced in ZBrush a couple versions back, and it's typically very good for giving you nice, even quad geometry. However, it's a little bit imperfect in a lot of cases. Sometimes in areas where you need very specific geometry, it's not great at capturing that. So I'm going to show you first what you would get right by default. These are the default settings that ship directly with the version of ZBrush. If you haven't messed with this at all, this is what you're going to get. Here you have your target polygon count, and it says 5. Now this is in increments of thousands, so 5 would mean 5,000. So this is going to give us 5,000 faces across this model. So let's go ahead and hit ZRemesher and see what the default gives us. I'll go ahead and pause the video and let it do its thing. Okay, so after ZRemesher, we get this. Now if we look at the polygons here, now we have good even quads throughout, but here's exactly what I was talking about. If we look around the eye, that geometry is nowhere near as good as the one that I had previously. Okay, but it would be a better scenario if you had Dynamesh on. And especially around the nostril. The nostril is completely destroyed. Okay, so like I said, there might be some errors in the default way you would actually go about Dynameshing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-Z to undo that. Okay, and now there's another step we can take to make sure that the geometry might be a little bit better than what it was at default. Now one thing I neglected to do the first time that you should always remember to do, now that I think about it, is make sure you have a duplicate of this subtool and remesh the duplicate, not the original. Alright, sorry I forgot to mention that earlier. So I'll just go ahead and say duplicate, and now I have a duplicate head. So now what I can do is remesh the duplicate. But this time, instead of just hitting ZRemesher by default, I'm going to go into my brushes here, and I'm going to go ahead, in my brush menu, I'm going to hit Z, because that's going to bring up the brush that I need, which is the ZRemesher Guides. Okay, so I'm going to click on ZRemesher Guides. This brush performs best when dynamic brush size mode is activated, so we'll go ahead and do that. Oops, let's first say OK, and we'll go ahead with the dynamic brush size, and we can also turn this down. We don't need the brush size as big as it was. So with the ZRemesher Guides on, what we can do is kind of help this process along. Go ahead and I'm going to turn that all the way down to 1. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm using a mouse right now, which you should use a tablet for this if you can help it. I'm drawing around, and you can see that it's drawing this curve. Okay? So this curve is a guide for how it should draw the topology. I'll draw a couple more around this eye because I want this geometry to flow in this direction. And this is pretty much true in any case when it comes to drawing any sort of topology that follows a specific structure. Like the eye is very oval or circular in shape, so we want to kind of draw our guides to resemble that underlying structure. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do another one. Now this isn't perfect. You might want to be a little bit more careful when you do yours, but this is just for the sake of the demonstration here. Okay, so I have that going through like that. So now what I want to do is do around the nose. I'm only going to do the one side. Okay. So I'm going to draw a guide loop around the nostril here and a second one. Okay. And maybe I'll also draw a topology guide around this area here. Alright, so I now have that in place. And now I'm going to hit the Z remesher again and see if the geometry suits us any better than the last version did. Okay, so here is our new topology, and let's go ahead and reveal the wireframe. And you can see that those topology guides did have an impact in helping out the way the topology is drawn. The eye geometry is now much, much better, but it's still not perfect. Because as we can see, Z remesher did its best job it possibly could, but there's still areas you don't like. I mean, I don't like, I should say. Like this quad right here, if we look at it in this specific area, the geometry is kind of broken in this area. And also up here we have kind of a break in the geometry. If you think of your topology as kind of like a roadway and you're following your roadway around here, you get to this point, all of a sudden you might be confused as to which direction to go. So this here poses a little bit of a problem. And also we have this down here that could pose a little bit of a problem here. And also let's take a look around the nostril. As you can see, the nostril is significantly better. Okay, again, still not perfect because we don't have nice flowing quads throughout the model. We kind of have a spirally type motion here. And if we compare it to the other side, which doesn't have any topology guides drawn, you can see the massive difference. If we go ahead and move this over a little bit, this is with topology guides, this is without. With topology guides, without. So you can see topology guides make a real significant difference in the final output of your retopologized mesh. Now, what you could have done, which I didn't do on purpose in this instance to show you the difference between the two, is with the Z remesher guides on, you could also go to transform and activate your symmetry. And if you were to draw a topology line, you can see it draws it on this side and on this side. Okay, so when you do draw your topology guides, you want to make sure you have symmetry on if you're working with a symmetrical mesh. But again, if we look up around the head here, I mean, it's not terribly important, I guess, that the topology flows perfectly even across the top of the head, since this part of the model is not going to deform. But however, when it comes to me personally, I'm kind of a stickler when it comes to good topology. I would find this unacceptable, you know, just because it doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason to it. I like my topology to really make sense all over the model, which is why in most cases I typically hand draw my own topology quad by quad in Maya using the quad draw feature, which I'm going to show you next. Okay, so I'm going to undo this and compare this to, actually I don't have to undo it because I still have that duplicated head, which should illustrate why it's important to make a duplicate. So I'll switch over to this other subtool here. I'll turn off the wireframe, and I will go ahead. Oh, I deleted the the subdivision levels. So whoops. I'll just go ahead and load in again my version that I redrew the topology quad by quad. Alright, so here's my version of the topology. So if we look around here, we can see that I have a much better structure around the nose, and in actuality I loaded a version previous because you can see I have some weirdness going on here. You can see some geometry peeking through, which I just smoothed out before I exported at this low level. You know, that's just what I would do, is make sure that that was nice and smooth before I exported. And you can also see around the eyes, I have much denser geometry. Okay, it allows for much more flexibility as far as deformation around the eyelid than you would have with a lower level. Okay, so that is a look at retopology, a quick look I should say, at one method of retopology inside of ZBrush using the ZRemesher guides. So now what I'm going to show you is how to export an OBJ version of a model and then load it into another program if you choose to draw quad by quad inside of another application. In this case, I'm going to use Maya, but you can also use a program like Topogun, which is a program specifically built just for retopology. However, with the addition of Maya 2014, I don't really find that program necessary anymore, considering that Maya now has a pretty sophisticated retopology set inside of that program now. Okay, so for whatever reason, my decimation master isn't working. I actually had to pause the video to look in to see what the problem was, and I can't quite seem to figure it out at this moment. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and give this a shot at 2.8 million polygons over in Maya. But just know this is not an ideal circumstance. If your decimation master works without a hitch, I recommend decimating the mesh before exporting it into Maya so you can work with maybe a few 100,000 polygons instead of a couple million, because I have a feeling Maya might not like this. So, but we're going to give it a try anyway. So, whoops. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and, if I can here, I'm going to go ahead and export this. I'll just go to my OBJs folder and I'll call this, yeah, just that. And I'll go ahead and save that. Let it do its thing there, and I'll go ahead and just close out of ZBrush. And now I'll go ahead and open up Maya here. Okay, so now that I have Maya open, I'm going to choose File and Import. And I'll switch over to just, actually I don't even need to do that. I can just go up here, go to my OBJs folder, and go ahead and import that. We'll see if this works. Okay. So it worked out all right, at least so far. We're even moving around the viewport okay with a couple million polys. So if I click on this mesh, you can see how dense it is. It's got a lot of polygons. However, what we want to do is retopologize it so we can extract the detail through texture maps and normal maps and displacement maps onto a much lower resolution mesh. So what I'm going to do to show you how to retopologize here is I'm going to go ahead and click on the mesh, and I'm going to make this surface live. Okay, with the mesh selected, we're going to go up to this magnet here, and this is make the selected object live. And what this means is whenever we draw points onto the model, vertex points, that they're going to snap right to the surface. So this is now a live surface. Okay, so we have the model live, and you can see when we go into our wireframe mode, we have this different shade of green than when it's not live. If I were to go there, you can see that it's its default form here. But as soon as we were to make this object live and we go into wireframe, you can see the wireframe's green, and that's how you know it works. Okay, so what I need to do is go into the new Modelers Toolkit. Well, newer. It was added in, I believe, Maya 2014, and that's this button right here. You can go ahead and click on that, and it's going to bring up our modeling toolkit. And what you're going to want to pay attention to for retopology is the quad draw. Okay, so if we go ahead and click on quad draw, we now have enabled that tool. And what we can do is we can start manually just drawing points onto the surface. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the eye. So click, left click, left click, left click, and left click. And what I've done is created 4 points so I can create a quad, and I do that by holding down the shift key and then clicking in the center of it, and we've drawn a new quad right on top of the surface. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and continue around the eye here. And this is the same exact method I used to get my model, so it should work just fine, because it worked just fine for me. So I'm going to hold down shift and click in the center of each of these faces, or potential faces I should say, and we have this new strip here. Now what we can do is if we hover over an existing point, you can see that it turns into a red circle, and we can go ahead and kind of move these points around. Okay, so if we don't like where we put them originally, you're not stuck with it. You can move them around. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and continue around the eye here. And I'll go ahead and finish off this surface here. And once again, I'll go ahead and move some of these points around. And the nice thing is these will stay attached to the surface unless you were to like rotate your camera here and you wildly like pull it off of the surface. You know, as long as you're making subtle manipulations, it's going to work out just fine for you. Now if we look in this instance here, we might also discover that we need more geometry. So if we hold down the control key and we go ahead and click here, and it'll add a new edge going across. Same thing if I hover over one of these edges and hold down control, you can see we get a preview of a new edge. So if we want to add more geometry, we can go ahead and just hold down control, left click, and you can see that we add a new edge. And the nice thing is it'll reconform to the underlying structure since this is a live surface. And naturally, we want to continue our geometry by clicking around. Okay, so hold down shift and left click inside here, and we're adding new points. New faces, excuse me. So we have that going around there. Typically, until I get a structure I like to keep my meshes fairly low res. That way we're not overflowing with geometry, because remember, this is just the next stage. After we retopologize, remember you're going to have to lay out a new UV map. Okay? And if you have an extremely dense model that has a lot of geometry, it's going to be much more of a nuisance to try to UV map that. Okay? Now if we go into our isolate selected mode, you can see what we get. And you can see here, if I go ahead and shade this, let me hit the selection tool, go out of that real quick, and you can see once I exit the modeling toolkit, it becomes geometry. Okay, so I just hit the selection key, or you can hit Q on your keyboard, and we have this selected in object mode, and I'll isolate it, and this is the surface we get. Okay, and you can see that it's following the curvature of that underlying geometry. So go ahead and select this mesh again and re-enter the quad draw tool, and we're now right back into quad draw. Okay, and what you would do is you would continue to draw quad by quad across your entire model. All right, now I imagine any of you that are doing retopology right now, that are watching this video, are fairly new at retopology. Just bear in mind that this is a process that requires time and patience, because you're essentially rebuilding your entire model. However, this time you have the added advantage of working with a model where you're just using this model as a template. And before this gets out of hand here, I'm going to go ahead and see what I'm getting so far with this configuration around the nose. Okay, so we have this configuration around the nose. Now, one thing other I want to show you here is that you can snap points to other points just by clicking and dragging and hovering close to another point, and you can see that once you get close enough, it snaps. Now, in this case, that's not ideal because I just created a triangle, but let's say, for instance, for whatever reason, you drew one too few points and you have something like this going on here. All right, so let's say for whatever reason you need to get rid of an edge. You can hold down Control and Shift, and you can see it brings up this X. So what I can do is I'm going to go ahead and click, and you can see it gets rid of that. While still holding down Control and Shift, I'll get rid of that, and we get a quad there. And now I can hold down Control, click there, add a new edge, and just move these points back into their correct positions the way they were before. Okay, I can hold down Control and add a new edge right there to add a little bit more density around this area. Now, earlier in the video, you heard me explain that you want to typically do this at the halfway point. At least I find it better that way, because what I typically don't like to do with remeshing is try to get into these really tight areas. You can see that this inside of the nostril here might become kind of tedious to try to retopologize inside of. So what I would do is typically instead take these right to the edge of the cavity, in this case the nostril here. Maybe I could stand to have one loop right here so I can get a little bit more of a solid definition around this point of the nostril. Okay, so here's the reason. So like I said, I don't want to try to retopologize inside of there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to exit the quad draw tool, select this mesh, I'll go ahead and isolate it. Now you can see the shape that we're getting so far here. And it's the same principle around the eye. I'll show you in both cases. Alright, so what I'm going to do is instead I'm going to go to edge mode here. I'll double click on this edge, and it's going to select the whole inside edge loop here. And I'm going to instead just extrude it. And then I'll hit extrude, and then I'll hit move, and I'll just kind of bring this straight down. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of scale it. Hit extrude again, bring this down as best we can there, and I'm going to hit scale, kind of bring that in. And maybe I can go ahead and rotate these a little bit. What I don't want to happen is if I were to happen to be looking at the model from this direction, I don't want to be able to see the opening there. Another thing you could possibly do if you want, I'm going to hit extrude one more time, bring this down a little bit more, hit scale, and this is what I did. Okay, scale all these points down. Whoops, got to be careful there. I'm going to hit F to frame in on this area here. And what I'll do is I'll just, with this edge still selected, I'll just go to my polygons menu set here and go to mesh and choose fill hole. Now that's going to create an n-gon down here, but that's not necessarily a big deal in this area. And if you want, you can go ahead and go into your, let's see, your multi-cut tool here, and you can go ahead and kind of close this off however you need. Since this is an area that we're not going to see, it's not of extreme importance that this geometry is sparkly clean. Okay, it might come into play when exporting into a program like Mudbox or ZBrush, because those programs typically don't like things that aren't quads, and they especially don't like things that aren't n-gons. Might be necessary to take something like this and turn it into a triangle. Okay, same thing here. I'll just turn this into a triangle there. All right. So that's why I typically don't like to do this at a completely high level, because I can just go ahead and extrude down instead of trying to retopologize that area. And then once again, select this model, unisolate it, and the next thing I will do is go back into Quad Draw, hold down Shift, and I can go ahead and return to my Quad Draw methods. Now something looks off right here, so it's important to keep an eye open on your model to make sure no screwiness has happened. Like in my case here, we can see that we have a point going off kilter here, so I can go ahead and kind of bring that back. Okay. So that's a look at retopology inside of Maya. Now, one more thing I'd like to mention before I close out this tutorial is you can use the ZRemesher and the quad draw function inside of Maya together. So one thing I'm not going to show you here because I just don't think it's necessary. You can bring a decimated mesh back from ZBrush, okay, that has not had any retopology work done on it. Then you could also export a Z-remeshed version of that model, overlay it on top of your decimated mesh, okay, and then delete the portions you want to redraw and keep the rest. That'll save you a bunch of work, okay, and you'll just have to redraw the areas that you need it most. So once again, export a decimated version of the high-res mesh, let me restart that. Export a decimated version of the high-res mesh, and then export a Z-remeshed low-res mesh, and bring them on top of one another inside of Maya. And then inside of Maya, you'll want to select the decimated mesh and make it live. That's this button here, remember. And then select your Z-remeshed model that's sitting right over top of it, and you'll just go into Quad Draw, and then you'll just delete what you don't want, and then redraw the new topology where you need very specific topology. Okay, so there's a look at retopology using either ZBrush or Maya, or both at the same time. Thank you for taking a look at this tutorial. I hope it was helpful. Leave your comments down below. Let me know what you thought. If you like this video, make sure you hit the thumbs up button and also subscribe, as it helps out my channel. And I will see you guys in the next video. Have a good one.